Hello friends, Sangeeta here. Welcome to Tilted Planet episode 20. I hope you all are being safe and well. So many things are happening and so fast that it is hard for me to keep up. I'm dedicating this episode to the Indo-Chinese relationship. I will tell you some stories from the past that you may or may not know. I will draw a picture of a future that you may or may not have imagined. So stay with me for the next 10 minutes or so. These events are a no surprise. I had warned about exactly this about 10 months ago in episode 15. I fear that India might end up becoming a proxy of the United States in a potential war of the United States against China. The United States and its allies are already looking to outsource their war with China. They need a battleground as far away from their land and as close to China as possible. And India, with its long border next to China and large population, fits the bill perfectly. Here is a history of the wars outsourced by the United States, Europe, and Russia. For those who haven't seen my previous episodes, I have renamed the wars to shed light on their warmongering, war outsourcing, and land grabbing. The 19th century Anglo-Russo-Cold War, 19th Kark W. Every South Asian should know about this conflict. It was started by Russia to engage the British as far away from their borders as possible. The British called it the Great Game. The Russians called it the Tournament of the Shadows. As a part of this conflict, Russia did a massive land grab. That land grab was such a massive that at one point the Russian soldiers ended up just a few hundred miles away from the Afghanistan border. That gobbled up land even became a part of the Soviet Union later. Something interesting and relevant today is a story from that war. You all are probably aware that the Tibetan leader, the Dalai Lama, has been in exile in India for about 60 years now. What you may not know is this is not the first time the Dalai Lama had to go into an exile. On December 12, 1903, the British invaded Tibet on the suspicion that Tibetans were entertaining the Russians by the comings and goings of a particular individual named Agwan Dorjiev. That action was outsourced to an army of Sikhs and Gurkhas who actually probably had nothing against the Tibetans. In any case, the Tibetans proved no match and were annihilated by this army. When Colonel Francis' young husband marched into Lhasa, the Dalai Lama had fled and there was no one to have a treaty with. The situation was saved at the time with the help of the Chinese, who the British acknowledged and recognized as the sovereign power over Tibet. The Chinese promptly appointed a new ruler. Now the West is saying that China is occupying Tibet when they themselves are responsible for it. Now moving on to other wars similarly outsourced. While 19th Kark W was going on, there began a big war in Europe involving the same European countries and Russia. I call that war First European War of the 20th century, First EWTC. they dragged and outsourced the war to the entire world. Then they started calling it World War I. Interestingly, China did not have a soldier fighting in that war, but a large number of Chinese laborers were used. A few decades later, the same countries resumed the war again, outsourced it again, called it World War II. I renamed it as Second European War of the 20th century, Second EWTC. A few decades later, the war broke out again between the United States, that had emerged as a superpower since the second EWTC, and Russia. They called it a Cold War. That only means no shot was fired on their own land, while the rest of the world was ravaged in the conflict. Brothers killed brothers in Asia, South America. Countries were divided, maps redrawn, not those of the belligerents, but those of the outsourced. After second EWTC, the colonization began to end. The Europeans left, sowing the seeds of conflict in their trail. They divided India because the Indians were not cooperating with the second EWTC. They needed people and land that was not hostile for their resources. And that's when and how Pakistan was born. Pakistan, particularly the West Pakistan, was also strategically important for the 19th Kark W. Since the 19th Kark W, the West and Russia have continued their efforts of outsourcing the war. Conflicts have happened all over the world, except on their own lands. And these countries have seen unprecedented development and prosperity, while the rest of the world is engaged with conflicts. The ex-colonies, either randomly divided or randomly cobbled together, keep fighting with each other. They keep taking the wars outsourced by these countries. The same thing is going on in the Middle East right now. Now coming back to India and China. The West has been grooming India as a potential outsourcee since 9/11. West started signing nuclear treaties with India without India signing the NTPT. India needs to tread very carefully here. India needs to take a page out of her own history. During the US-Russia Cold War, India remained peaceful. India also led the non-aligned movement of the like-minded countries. They can look into reviving that non-aligned movement now. One more reminder, in case Indians are rooting to have United States as an ally. The United States has a history of randomly retreating or abandoning their partners in the war. They retreated in Korea, they abandoned Vietnam, Pakistan, Afghanistan, very recently Afghanistan again, and the Kurds. How can they do that without any consequences? The US has a very strategic geographical advantage of being protected by the Arctic and the Canada to the north, Mexico and the entire South America to the west, and oceans to the east and the west. They can afford to use and dispose of relationships as per their convenience. The United States has imposed sanctions on India before. They use sanctions as a foreign policy against selective countries that refuse to dance to their tunes. Now coming back to China and India, both are ancient civilizations and neighbors who had not fought a war until very recently after India's independence. So, if both countries stay on the course that they are now, they will both lose. They will be drawn into a long-standing conflict. It would be just like the conflict between India and Pakistan, which has helped neither countries but has helped the countries they buy the weapons from. So what is a better path? A healthy competition and cooperation. India has to up her game to remain competitive with China. At the same time, they must cooperate with China and other South Asian countries to focus on one very real issue. What real issue? Water. A conflict with China will endanger a precarious and already fragile Himalayan ecosystem that they rely upon. It is in the interest of all involved countries to act responsibly to preserve their very source of life, the Himalayan glaciers. In my previous episodes, I have explained the reasons why India, Pakistan and Bangladesh should reunite. I am now proposing an even bigger union, a union of all countries that take water from the Himalayas. That doesn't mean that they have to become one country necessarily, but they just have to cooperate like European countries are cooperating under EU. And it is not just water. With water also comes the mineral that makes the land fertile. Obviously, they need to fight their own identity myopias and biases and racism against each other to form this union. If it can happen in Europe, it can happen in Asia as well. That identity reformation as the children of the Himalayas is possible and necessary at this time. Help me out. Please subscribe, comment, like, share for a better world. Our grandchildren will ask us, what were you doing when the snow caps were melting in the Himalayas? We better have a good answer for them.